Hello everyone, and welcome to the Almanac Comicopia, your guide through the original DC universe. As mentioned in the welcome video, our very first chapter looks at the origins of some characters from the Golden Age. These stories all take place on Earth too, but we'll speak more on that another time. Episode 1 centers on the little-known first-masked hero of DC, Lee Travis, the Crimson Avenger, in the definitive treatment of his origin story, Secret Origins number 5, written by the Thomases. Roy and Dan Thomas are two names you'll get used to in the Almanac, as this husband and wife team made it their mission to bring focus to and integrate DC's disparate properties from yesteryear in order to curate a vibrant picture of the Golden Age, one that readers of the 1940s could not have accessed. This is because DC acquired numerous other publishers' characters throughout its original era, many of whom we will explore here in the Almanac. Anyway, this time around, my favorite husband and wife team, the Thomases, are assisted by an art team of Gene Collin, Mike Gustovich, Carl Gafford, and David Cody Weiss. Before moving on, I want to make it clear that this story was indeed published in 1986, as one of the final entries into the original canon. The comic proper begins with a full-page splash. Credits to Collin and Weiss for their choices here. The lettering on Secret Origins, the Crimson Avenger, really pops for me. The Avenger is truly larger than life here, his figure becoming part of the city skyline. The various windows and arrangements of their lighting bring me into the diegesis, which feels paradoxical when I'm considering the giant half-man in the sky, after all. Lastly, I love that the gun is smoking. It's not for show. The text establishes the setting of the story as pre-World War II, at the time when the Japanese had steadily been conquering China. With respect to these events, further flavor text reads,
"In a world careening swiftly toward the brink of madness, is it any wonder that one man chooses to don a mask?"
Turning the page yields a rather unmentionable start to the story, with 3 panels featuring a man, you know who, shaving. His narration is framed by the delightful storytelling device you see on screen.
From the secret dictaphone journal of Lee Travis.
I relish the suggestion that what transpires is unreliable, at the very least in the minutiae of its detail. Why? Well, since comics can be fantastical, I find anything which aids my ability as a reader to suspend my disbelief invaluable. The most important takeaway from this section is that Lee Travis is aware of his luck, at 25 years of age and already the publisher of his own paper. On our protagonist's way to work, Lee remarks to his driver Wing, "Got to hand it to our man in Geneva. 2 days before it's official. He sure stumbled onto a good story this time." Lee marvels while reading over the latest edition of his paper. "No, sir," Wing replies, and then more sternly, in response to Lee's confused, "What was that, driver? I didn't hear." Wing cuts him off, saying, "I said, surely no story can be good, Mr. Travis, when more than 3 million Chinese have died in only a little more than a year of fighting." He continues, "Do you know how many thousands perished only last week when Hankow fell?" Pausing for a moment, I want to acknowledge how deftly the Thomases have requested readers to confront the genuine historical setting that our superheroes originally emerged in lieu of an exploitative glossing over, a much more common outcome which renders the context of a story little more than set dressing. Furthermore, I appreciate the commentary by the Thomases on how those with the privilege and inclination to engage in superheroism aren't necessarily socially literate enough to understand the issues they're fighting for or against. Returning to the conversation, Lee defends himself. "Now, don't misunderstand me, Wing.
That is your name, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
I feel as strongly about this China thing as you do.
Powerful stuff here. This China thing. Ugh. Also, the need to use Wing's name after double checking it, that reeks of insecurity. Travis goes on to explain further.
That's why I'm in this business. To print the truth about such horrors, so that other Americans will care too.
Amazingly, Wing calls him out on this posturing. Very honorable of you, sir, but if I may speak freely. To which Lee assures him,
This is a free country, Wing.
what a great touch that adds personality to our burgeoning protagonist. As they emerge from the car, Wing lets him have it.
You cannot possibly feel as strongly as I do, sir. You see, Hankow was once my home.
Did this impact Lee? Turning the page yields more narration, and we discover from his own words.
I guess I felt a twinge, even then. But not much of one. Not really. I was too busy all day.
What was he so busy with, you may wonder? Well, he has a tell-all interview with one Claudia Barker. Lee clocks her as a
Vassar girl.
since
They always have a hint of challenge in their voice.
classic misogyny. I love how the Thomases don't shy away from the idea that with one's tendency to mask up and fight crime, likely comes some form of insecurity. In a full-page spread of flashbacks on the next page, Lee goes on to tell Ms. Barker all about his life up until now. I have to admit that certain details therein paint Lee as a more complex character than I originally gave him credit for. First, on the damning side of things. He begins his life story by claiming that
My family felt the pinch of the Depression.
in one breath, while in the next acknowledging that
Fortunately, my godfather had weathered the stock market storm better than most.
this is an understatement, as the man provided Lee a university-level education in journalism, while his fellow Americans suffered. Shown now is a moment from the middle of his story, the moment where Lee's life changed forever.
I was hit in the leg by one of Franco's snipers my third day off the boat.
Lee is in the midst of explaining to Claudia how he ended up disregarding his godfather's warnings about fighting for the wrong side in the Spanish Civil War to follow his heart and ethics, joining up with the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, better known now as the Lincoln Battalion. It was at this point in my original read that I had to stop and attempt to properly educate myself at least a little bit on the Spanish Civil War, since I admittedly knew literally nothing about it prior to reading the comic. Furthermore, and in line with the goals of this almanac, I wished to understand what exactly the Thomases wished to establish about Lee Thomas, and, better yet, why they were interested in doing so. Before I say anything else, I do want to clarify that I have only done cursory research on the subject to facilitate my understanding of the character, Lee Travis, for all y'all. And on that point, for better and more accurate information on the Spanish Civil War, I recommend the 6-part TV miniseries from 1983 that I've linked in the description. You can also just find it on YouTube. Anyhow, what's relevant to our story is that a coalition of various leftist groups, i.e. socialists, communists, anarchists, came together to support Spain's Republican government, notably doing so despite the differences of those groups' values, and, more interestingly, despite some of those groups' very rejection of the Republican government in the years leading up to this civil war. Why the unity? Well, a military group mistakenly believed they could easily overthrow the Republican government in a coup d'etat. This group was couched in the politics of Spain's nationalist faction, a title used to poorly obfuscate its Nazi influence and aid. It was able to unify disparate parties much the way the leftist groups would coalesce to support the Republicans. To my knowledge, any given nationalist supporter wasn't a guaranteed Nazi themselves, but rather they were people who, by their investment in a high-consequence ideology such as Spain maintaining a Catholic backbone with respect to its culture and politics, general sense of traditionalism, or even desiring monarchism, these people aligned with the wrong side of history. Back to our blossoming flower, Lee Travis. Despite the United States' policy of non-intervention in the war, volunteers who sought to make a difference benefited from the organizational resources of the Communist International, a group led and controlled by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. These people were able to form the Lincoln Battalion, which our Lee Travis was part of. It's worth noting the Lincoln Battalion was about 50-50 white and black, a very racially progressive environment for the times. Lee laments in his tell-all that, "My godfather threatened to disinherit me if I got tangled up on what he considered the wrong side in the Spanish Civil War, or even if I set so much as 1 foot on Spanish soil." I imagine Lee is still angry about that point. The Thomas's inclusion of this detail, for the historically literate, paints him as a genuinely heroic and compassionate person, in spite of those stilted interactions with Wing. And furthermore, it asks readers once again to interrogate the socio-political environment that the Golden Age heroes were reared in. I mean, sheesh, this guy was gonna be disinherited for fighting fascism. Let that soak in. Conveniently, that old fart changed his mind and bequeathed the Globe Leader newspaper to the lad, and something else I find rather loathsome, but no spoilers on that point. Miss Barker and Lee now continue their conversation, wherein she rightfully calls out his
Harry Godfather. Mustn't forget him.
When it comes to his success, she goes on.
I'll leave out the youthful idealism, though, since you seem to have outgrown that. But then, haven't we all?
This panel goes hard. Lee is somehow convincing in his retort, even if it's only convincing to himself. Shout out to the art team once again for managing to portray people as people.
Speak for yourself, lady. I've just switched my fight from the front lines to the front page. That's all.
If the Thomases weren't having enough vicarious fun with Lee Travis via Claudia, then they must have had their fill after this next exchange. Travis politely suggests that he and the reporter might see one another again at the charity event mentioned in an excluded speech bubble. Claudia's reply?
Since it's a masquerade party, you probably won't recognize me. I'll know you, though. You'll be the one dressed as a bleeding heart.
Iconic. Here I am lampooning this man for not being with it, much like it seems the Thomases would like me to, as evidenced by the prior conversation with Wing. Yet, he's a bleeding heart to his contemporaries. I love this multifaceted nature of Lee's political self in the eyes of the Thomases. A page later, we see Lee preparing for the costume party. This scene teases out a laugh, as he informs us in his audio tape log that the costume's label read,
Highway robber.
and that,
Considering what they charged for one night's rental, that was descriptive in more ways than one.
then, a moment later, he dons the highway robber garb, treating us to a sneak preview of The Avenger. Coming up next, here on the Almanac Communicopia, the Great Wing versus the Newspaper Centrist. Round 2, fight! If we're keeping score, the old Crimson Avenger has a career score of 0-2 right now, albeit in exclusively verbal jousts and entirely out of costume. Round 2 versus the humble Wing starts with our protagonist seeking some laudits from the driver.
And after our conversation this morning, you'll be happy to hear that all the proceeds will go to aid your own suffering people in China.
Lee proclaims, only for Wing to goad him on.
That is so?
So Lee does, going on and on about how the ultra-wealthy will be there with open hearts and open checkbooks when, suddenly...
Wing, what's wrong? What's the idea of slamming on the brakes like that?
Lee exclaims, rightfully jarred. I love this Wing guy. We find out that he feels the need to look his employer in the eye before he says something meaningful, which warrants the full stop. Then he informs his boss,
It is easy for men and women to be generous with something they have so much of.
but of course, Lee does not understand, so Wing gets more direct.
Perhaps if this were America's war, your people dying, you would be less likely to think of helping its cause with a mere masked ball.
Nailed it. Lee tries to argue back with Wing, but catches himself parroting his godfather's arguments against Lee's own involvement back in the Spanish Civil War. Nice. This half-page splash transitions us out of the scene and into the next one. Take a look at the motion lines and smoke on the automobile. They really sell the getting out of town feel. Plot-wise, Lee tried to change the subject of the conversation by expressing his wish to purchase a firearm to complete his costume, noting in the process that its makers failed to include even a measly water pistol. Wing, as the truly based character he's been thus far, is packing a pistol for self-defense, one which he hands over to his boss without the latter ever asking. I enjoy the slightly comedic, but unfortunately, obviously consequential dialogue included in the splash.
You may want to unload it all the same, sir. After all, you're not likely to run into any highwaymen in the wilds of New Jersey.
During the ball, out of nowhere, a terrified woman cries out,
Help! The Martians have landed! Right here in New Jersey!
The Thomases have a solid funny bone as they write a guest smarmy.
Isn't it a pity? There's always one at every party who has too much to drink.
In response, in a subsequent and omitted panel. In the midst of others' retorts, the radio blares out news about a struggle between a fighting machine from Mars and a cohort of 7,000 soldiers. Of course, this is Orson Welles broadcasting, according to a guest who Lee surmises must be Miss Barker. Having diffused the situation, this odd couple takes to dancing. It's cute. Then, Lee laments in the audio log that they had
Barely made it once around the dance floor when...
The gatesman appears, frantic and seemingly swindled by the broadcast. He calls out,
Martians! Clear out! They're heading this way!
Here is where the tone of the comic shifts very abruptly and effectively, I'll add. Lee laments further in his audio log.
That panicked guard never got a chance. Suddenly, he burst into flame like Methuselah's last birthday cake.
Which is a biblical reference that you, like me, may not have gotten. Don't feel bad. Notice how the weapon is emerging from outside the panel that it's actually acting in. This decision helps speed things up in terms of the action, but it also makes the weapon as we perceive it in our minds as readers as larger and more mysterious, potentially Martian, and certainly more dangerous. Things happen very quickly now, communicated quite effectively, in my opinion, by the high angle chosen for the first panel, as well as the sheared off tops of those first two panels, the narrowness of the second one, and the superposition of the lead Martian over the panel which I showed in the prior slide. This is a great composition, and it's probably worth reading the comic for, well, on its own. Audiolog Lee assures us, almost comically, that after he shoved the guard into the Vingilder pool on, quote, sheer instinct, quote,
Somebody else was diving in to fish him out again when I heard Claudia scream.
Oh my god!
I ought to say, Lee, that sounds like awfully convenient revisionism to me. Anyway, the Martians totally act like gangsters, wink wink nudge nudge.
No one make a move. Just hand over your valuables, Earthlings, and no one gets hurt.
Our Avenger is unimpressed by the performance and calls them out immediately, remarking to Claudia that they're
More likely from Chicago's South Side.
A moment later, Mr. Van Gilder himself addresses the gangsters, just like a rich person who thinks they could get away with absolutely anything no matter what they do ever would do, who promptly then cut him down with a Tommy gun. Unfortunately, Claudia's hot-headedness gets her killed next. I wonder if this is what our Avenger will be avenging. Some dialogue of note occurs in the second and third panels. The gangster fully outs himself as one, ordering,
Toss down that rod, gun, too, Earthman.
Lee, of course, took Wing's advice, and thus, without a true weapon, complies.
Sure, no bullets anyway.
This is surely the trigger for Claudia's temper, addressing Lee's lack of ammo with a furious,
Isn't that always the way with guys like you?
seemingly pretentious to her last breath. Claudia chokes out,
Che vindice I biti.
which is Latin intended to translate to "The Avenger will come." Here's where I get on my soapbox. I fucking love Miss Barker, and I wish that she didn't get fridged like this. I understand that she was not part of the original comics, and thus the Thomases were not able to make an important character survive that was inexplicably missing from all of those stories. However, because this is a reimagining, I want to reimagine that she didn't get killed, and for reasons we'll talk about later, was much more involved in Wing and Lee Travis's adventures. Moving on. Thankfully, Wing continues to be insanely based, helping the bitter truth of Claudia's death go down a little bit easier. Lee Travis runs to the car, and after asking about the gunshots immediately, explains to Wing that
Gangsters in rubber suits shot 2 people and stole everything they could get their hands on, including the charity proceeds. Hop out! I'm going after them, and no reason for you getting shot at.
Wing's reply had me shout yes at the top of my lungs, followed by some giggles from sheer enjoyment.
Get in back. That money was meant for my people, remember?
Moments later, as they speed off, nice vroom, right? Lee laments the loss of his gun, only for Wing to tell him,
It's okay, boss man. I've got another one under the seat.
let's pause for a moment to take stock of what's actually happening right now. A newspaper man whose wartime experience was taking a bullet to the leg after 2 days on shore, and his armed driver, whose history we do not know, are chasing a car full of armed gangsters who are certainly well versed in violence. They're high off some murders, at the moment at least. The Thomases cannot pretend that this isn't what's happening. So it turns out that even these authors needed a solid ass pull to support Wing and his boss's success in their endeavor. Audiolog Lee tells us here that
One well-aimed round from a Tommy gun would have finished Wing and me. If it weren't for the bulletproof armor plating my paranoid godfather had installed on the limo he left me.
this is some rough stuff here, y'all. if it's true. I imagine there's at least a grain of truth in it, and you know what? There's no way I can't imagine that grain of truth does revolve around the car being bulletproof. And that brings me back to an earlier point about the other thing that the Godfather gifted Lee Travis. I know that superheroes need certain favors in order to become legitimate in their legacy, but the armored car from the same man who gave him the newspaper, who's the same man who almost disinherited him for his ethics, it's just a little convenient for me, and I think it's a low point of Thomas's writing in the story. And I'm being so critical because it is in the form of an ass pull. In any case, I can get behind Wing being amazing in more ways much more easily than I can the car being bulletproof, hence the rest of the scene doesn't pose a problem for me.
Hang on, Mr. Travis. I'm going to swerve her hard.
And boy does he. This allows the honestly intelligent Lee to make use of the opening. I love the placement of the sound effects near the muzzle flare. In the subsequent omitted panels, the shots hit the flamethrower's tank, incinerating the gangster holding it. The Thomases managed to squeeze more personality into the scene by having Lee admit via audio tape that he was actually aiming at the man and missed, and now the gangster's driver speeds up and loses control. Miraculously, the gangsters are able to flee the flaming vehicle, leaving the Avenger to chase them on foot into the wilderness. Honestly, this is straight madness on his part. If you can defend this guy's actions in the comments, please do it. It's not like Claudia was the love of his life. It's not like he's really got anything to prove to Wing. It's not like he actually fought in that war for all that time. This is insanity for me. But it leads to ass pull 2, which is even worse. The gun's out of bullets. Moving onwards with this action scene, we get these 2 shots of Lee chasing the third of the 4 gangsters. Really let this soak in. Take a note of how the angles are adding a sense of momentum to the scene. I wish I was more into what was happening and believing in it, because the art does a great job of portraying it as thrilling. And I don't want that to go unmentioned because sometimes writers get hindered by poor art. Next, we actually jump back to a few moments prior, with Lee explaining in the audio log,
Wing had got out to help me and was having some troubles of his own.
The charming and totally inoffensive gangster tells Wing that he's
Wrangled chickens with thicker necks than yours, rickshaw boy.
But then Wing simply flips the guy, using the terrain wisely and stating victoriously that he might not have a thick neck, but he also isn't thick-headed. I love Wing. Unfortunately, gangster number 2 wasn't KO'd properly, and he pops back up with our heroes in his sights, exclaiming that
This gun makes a lot of noise, but it still knows how to keep a secret real good.
I love the Thomas's gangster dialogue. Turning the page hits you like a sack of bricks, right? Ass pull 3. Best ass pull. The guy's getting shot out of nowhere. Bada boom.
You two alright?
This pipe and shotgun wielding man asks calmly. He informs the boys that he's
Bill Doc, this is my farm.
His further commentary reveals that he's been totally caught up in the Orson Welles hysteria, unaware he'd shot a not-so-innocent man. Here's where we approach the end of the comic. In the fallout of the scene, Lee finds Miss Barker's lighter, discovering imprinted on it the same words that she uttered moments prior to dying. Curiously, the lighter is also marked Spain, 1936. As the comic closes, Lee decides he'd rather remain anonymous and flees before the cops arrive. If it wasn't clear, it turns out that Miss Barker was actually part of the resistance in some capacity when it came to the Spanish Civil War. And her comments about youthful idealism and the like were self-directed in some fashion. Her edginess likely also a byproduct of her disillusionment with her fellow man. In any case, while Secret Origins number 5 wasn't the best or most interesting comic, and I don't know if I'd go as far as saying you must read it, there's some pretty good content in here. And I don't think you'd regret it if you did. I think I've said enough about Wing and the World War II commentary at this point. However, I didn't pay too much attention to the interweaving of Orson Welles' famous War of the Worlds broadcast, so if you've got any ideas or analysis about that, I would love to hear from you down below. Finally, I just want to return back to Claudia Barker for a moment. If this was a new comic, part of the modern age, and not one of the final dying breaths of the original universe, I would have liked it if Claudia didn't die and instead revealed herself to be quite the ally to the Crimson Avenger. In terms of how Claudia is actually used in the story, I think that the Thomases intended to communicate that her adherence to values that she was struggling with or grew suspicious of, and then more specifically that Lee Travis realizing that she had that struggle because of the lighter is the genesis for his Crimson Avenging. It's not her death. And in that way, when I made fun of him and her before, I erred. And I owe them an apology. Not the Thomases, the characters. And while I do, of course, imagine Lee Travis operating with her in mind, I don't think that it's as an object of revenge or pity, but more so as a philosophical ideal, somebody who embodied the values that he was struggling with himself. Wrapping up, this episode of the Almanac Comicopia has been brought to you by Rachel.
Hi!
And myself, Troy. And we're hoping that you've had an informative and enjoyable stint with us today. Tune back next time for an episode about Wesley Dodds, the original Sandman.